Question 1. List the 5 goals of the scientific method. The first one is to observe and theorize, to observe the process or the study you want to do and theorize what's going to happen at the end of the study. Next is to formulate a hypothesis, design the study, collect your data, and then based on your results, you apply that data and distinguish whether or not your hypothesis was correct and how the results can be used in next studies to change and find out more about like the condition or whatever the study may have been. Next question is what are the two schools of thought that began psychology? The first one was structuralism, which was introduced by William Wundt's student Edward Titchener, and it aimed on analyzing that psychology was made of basic elements and structures, and that it was studied of our conscious mental processes and not the unconscious, because it couldn't be proved or studied or measured in any way. So if it couldn't be proved or studied, then it wasn't necessarily true. And the next one was functionalism, which was introduced by William James, and functionalism taught that psychology was a fluid course, and it wasn't fixed and it wasn't structuredized, and it could be studied. You could study the unconscious to find out different things, and it didn't necessarily have to be proven or have tangible or physical evidence, and it was more popular in industrial psychological practices. And the next question is 2 limitations on the experimental method. So the first one would be the placebo effect, because when researchers don't let participants know whether they're going to be in the experimental group or the control group, then that's the only way they can accurately find whether or not like the drug or whatever the control or experiment was worked. If not, because if they would know, then their expectations would then change the outcome, because they're expecting higher or lower depending on the drug or whatever. And the other one is a sample bias. So it's when participants are it's like a bias selection of the experimental and the control groups, and it has a systemic difference among all the groups, so it's not really fair. And it's kind of like an example would be testing for poverty in a certain school district, but all the students that fill out the questionnaire are in a richer neighborhood. So then you can't really define whether there's actual poverty in that school district if they only assess a certain neighborhood that is normally higher income. The next question is name an animal right and a human right that is used for an experiment. So an animal right a human right would be legality, which is all research done on humans has to conform to federal, local, and state laws and all the regulations. And a human right would be the minimization of discomfort. So it's when the researchers or whoever's doing the studies has to ethically follow and kind of minimize the amount of discomfort or danger or just negative outcomes of the animal as much as possible, or as much as they can possibly regulate, because a lot of the times certain outcomes, animals get hurt in these studies and they didn't anticipate for it, but they are required by law to try their best to minimize any pain to these animals. Next question is to list parts of the neuron. The first is the dendrites, so they're like the tree-like, stem-like parts of the neuron, and they're the primary signal receivers, so they're the ones that receive basically the majority of the information from neurons. Next connected is the soma, or also known as the cell body, which holds the nucleus, so it produces basically all the metabolic processes and the functions that are important to the nucleus. So it's kind of like the life of the entire body. Next is the axon, which is it's just a longer extension of the neuron, and it has basically the same exact functions as what happens in a neuron. They also take out metabolic functions, and the axon is spread out into terminals, which then sends signals to your bodies and to the body and muscles and glands. Next is the myelin sheath, which is the coating around the axon that kind of acts as insulation to protect it, and it makes like the transmission of all the information go faster and be more efficient. And lastly is the axon terminal, or it's the end of the axon, and it's where the transmitters are finally released out into the body. And then next is two glands. Name two glands of the endocrine system and their functions. The first one is the pituitary gland, which produces our hormones that control our growth rate and activate other glands in our bodies that are found in both men and women. And then the next one is the pineal gland, which is found in our brain, and it produces and regulates the amount of melatonin we produce, which is also found in men and women. And melatonin controls our sleepiness and our wakefulness, and it affects our biological clock. Two theories that explain color vision. The first one would be the trichromatic theory, which emphasizes that there's three different kinds of independent codes and lanes that the receptors in our retina have, and each singular cone is created to maximize the amount of chemical responses that each cone will receive from three different colors, which is blue, green, and red. And then the other theory is the opponent process theory, which highlights that there's three kinds of cells that respond by either decreasing or increasing the rate that the cells are firing depending on which color is being presented and interpreted. So the first one would be like the red and green cells. If they're firing red, if they're presented with red, then the firing rate for red cells are going to increase, and then greens are going to decrease. And then the yellow-blue cells, if they're presented with yellow, then the yellow ones are going to increase and the green ones are going to decrease. And then lastly, the third kind of cell is when the response rate for a white light increases and they decrease the response rate when there is no light present at all. So the primary taste sensations are sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami, which is a combination of like savory and salty kind of. And then the two prior knowledge influences are bottom up processing, which is data driven, and it's where we get we're influenced by the stimulus in front of us and the perception we get from the stimulus, and we don't have any prior knowledge of that certain thing. So it's foreign information that we've never seen, and we're trying to make conclusions or cognitive connections. An example would be like a bus where they have like a lot of different buttons and if you're not normally driving a bus, you don't know like all the mechanics of it. So you're trying to figure out what you're doing using all those different tools if you've never encountered them before, so you don't have any prior knowledge. And then the other one is top-down processing, which is theory-driven, was when we use our already background information or expectations to influence how we see something and how we interpret it, and we kind of like fill in the blanks and already finish what the thing is being presented to it, what the stimulus is trying to present. So an example would be like a connect the dots of an image that isn't completely finished, but we can already tell what it is because we've seen that image before. So our brain uses that prior knowledge influence to complete the image because we already have seen it before. So the next question is, what is synesthesia? So synesthesia is the capacity to experience unusual sensations along with ordinary ones. So it's basically experiencing multiple senses at once that wouldn't normally be experienced. So an example would be individuals who associate colors with like a certain word being spoken to them, or individuals who associate a certain scent when they taste something, even though like this thing they're tasting doesn't have a scent. It's just a chemical, or it's just a reaction that they have in their brain where they experience multiple sensations at once. So what is consciousness? Our consciousness is everything of which we are aware of in a certain given time, which includes our thoughts, our feelings, sensations, and the perceptions of our external environment or external stimuli that is being presented to us. And then the two theories of sleep are the restorative theory of sleep, which just basically says that sleep was created to restore our brain and our body, and the circadian sleep theory, which is an evolutionary perspective that sleep was evolved to keep us humans out of harm's way and to avoid from becoming prey at night, because back then, like cavemen, they would sleep during the night to avoid being attacked or becoming prey. Um, one dysomnia and one's parasomnia and one dysomnia. A parasomnia would be a sleep terror, which they occur during stage 4 of sleep, and these people who experience sleep terrors wake up screaming really loudly from like intense fear, but they don't remember what the dream was, and it does not occur in REM sleep. It occurs in non-REM sleep, and it happens like right after the person has fallen asleep. So they wake up screaming really loudly, like a fast heart rate, and they're out of breath, and they're just very flustered. And then a dysomnia would be insomnia, which is a sleep disorder, which is more severe because it could cause like you might need to take medicine for it, and it's when people just have difficulty falling asleep or staying like asleep, or they may wake up too early, or their sleep is very light and they're woken up by like any small disruptance. It's poor quality and they're very restless when they sleep. So the theories of hypnosis. The first one is social cognitive theory, which is that the behavior of a hypnotized person is the function of the person's expectations. So like I was saying earlier about like placebo effect. If for hypnosis, the social cognitive theories, if they know that they're going to be hypnotized, they're going to try their hardest to be like a good person to be hypnotized, because they know they're going to be hypnotized, so they already have certain expectations and they're trying their hardest to do it. So it's not really like a natural thing because they're actively trying. The next one would be neo dissociative theory, which is that hypnosis is split into it includes a split or a dissociation between two aspects that control our consciousness. So it's a split between two. And the next one is the theory of dissociation, which is that hypnosis weakens our control of executive function over other parts of our consciousness, which allows the hypnotist to like suggest and a contact influence that directly affects ours, or directly can like affect a certain system that they're trying to attack with like their hypnosis. Physical drug dependence is a compulsive pattern use in which the user they end up getting a drug tolerance, also with accompanied with withdrawal, like really severe withdrawal symptoms, and it's usually when the use is when they haven't used drugs, and many times these individuals are gonna need like higher dosages to feel the same high they used to before with a smaller dosage, and it's usually when a substance counselor has to step in because they might need rehab or something like that, because they've become physically dependent, not psychologically dependent, where it's affecting their bodily functions. Um, One stimulant would be cocaine, and cocaine produces feelings of excitement. It boosts your mood, and you get feelings of euphoria. It also suppresses your hunger, and when you have withdrawals from cocaine, you have severe depression and fatigue. Hallucinogen would be marijuana, and marijuana affects your ability to create new memories, and it also produces the same feelings of euphoria and relaxation, and you're very calm. But withdrawal symptoms have you experience severe anxiety and you can't sleep. You're very restless. The next question is the four theories that explain dreams. So there's psychoanalysis, which is introduced by Freud, that our dreams have unconscious or underlying meanings that connect to our conscious life, and they influence our tendencies that we do when we're awake. Then there's activation synthesis, which is just when our neurons are firing and interpreting the stimulus that we experience like right before we fell asleep. So it's like when we watch a movie, if you watch a specific movie about the Little Mermaid, then you have a dream about the Little Mermaid because it's what your neurons just experienced. prior to you falling asleep. Then there's an evolutionary theory that our dreams were created for us to practice certain scenarios to prepare us in case that scenario was to happen in our real life. So it's basically like a trial run of our life that gives us time to prepare for what could happen. And then the last one is the cognitive theory, which is just that dreaming is simply just thinking while sleeping, that there's no underlying meaning or greater effect on our conscious life. The divisions of the nervous system are divided by the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system is our nerves that connect to the spinal cord, and then the nervous system compromises the brain when it connects. So the peripheral system is divided into somatic and automatic, and somatic controls our skeletal muscles, and it's in charge of our reaction to like external environment or external stimuli. And then autonomic regulates our internal environment, like our blood and our organs and our vessels and all that stuff. And then autonomic is then divided into two, which is sympathetic and parasympathetic. So sympathetic just prepares our body for action when we're in a flight or fight response. Like we start sweating, or our heart rate increases, or we salivate, or we start shivering or we're cold. And then parasympathetic just conserve that energy just in case we need it, and it returns our body back to normal after we've experienced that emergency, or we're coming down from the sympathetic stage. You go into parasympathetic, which is like going back to normal, to our regulatory stage. And then in the central nervous system, it's divided into the brain and the spinal cord, and the spinal cord just connects the brain to the peripheral nervous system. And then pruning, myelination, and plasticity. Pruning is a process that was developed for our brain to basically just get rid of and eliminate unnecessary or redundant synapses that we don't need, and it's not producing any information or any connections or any no important information is being transmitted. Myelination is the development of the myelin sheaths that are around the axon, and it accounts for the processing speed and our memory depending on which stage of life we are. So the myelination isn't like fully developed until our late 20s. So we're always in a different stage of myelination, and depending on what that is, well then obviously our memory and our processing speed is going to be different. Like a 20-year-old cannot remember the same way that a 2-year-old can. Sensation, transduction, and perception. Sensation are just our senses that we pick up, whether it be auditory, visual, or other sensory stimuli that gets sent to our brain. And then there's transduction, which is the process in which our sensory receptors convert that stimulation into neural impulses. And then perception is the way our brain interprets or organizes the certain stimuli that is being sent from all of our senses, whether it be auditory or visual or whatever kind of senses. It's the way we perceive it and how our brain organizes it, whether it like we've seen it before, we haven't seen it. What is timbre? So it's a physical characteristic and the quality of a certain sound that gives its unique qualities. So it's distinguished from like other sounds of the same exact pitch or loudness or intensity. So an example would be like a guitar and a piano playing the same exact note, but they sound different because they have different timbres, I believe is how you pronounce it. Since it's different, that's why it sounds different, even though it's the same exact like intensity and pitchness and everything. So the 3 characteristics of critical thinking are to practice, to exercise, and to repeat the practice again, because it's the only way that our critical thinking can be established and beneficial. And is psychology a science? Psychology is considered a science because it's defined as behavioral and mental processes. Psychology is considered a science because it uses all steps of the scientific method, and when there's replication of the same studies, when we use a scientific method, they find the same exact they conclude with the same exact findings, so it's not like different conclusions if they do the same exact process. And then an imaging technique would be a CT scan or a computerized tomography, which is basically just a rotating machine that takes x-rays, and those x-rays capture cross-sectional images of our brain, which reveal structures, abnormalities, and injuries, and that includes tumors or any evidence of strokes that are either recent or non-recent. And that's it.